Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with roasted apple and parsnip soup. That's right, it's been a long time since I've done one of these comforting middle of winter soups. But in fairness, it has been a long time since it's been the middle of winter. But anyway, this really did come out quite well, so I'm looking forward to sharing it with you. And while technically this is a food wish, it was actually inspired by a trip to a local gastropub where I enjoyed a beautiful bowl of parsnip soup, and I asked the server what was in it, and he said roasted apples, parsnips, and a potato. And I thought to myself, I think I could make that. And as it turns out, I could. So check it out. This was as easy as it was delicious. So for step one, we're going to prep our parsnips and apples for roasting. And to do that, I'm going to peel the parsnips, and then we'll cut them into some roastable size pieces. Keep in mind, this stuff is going to be blended, so the exact sizes aren't that important. Although we do want everything to kind of roast at the same rate, but as long as they're close, you're good. And one thing to pay attention to when you're trimming parsnips, they can have kind of a tougher woody center. Sometimes on these smaller ones, it's not that noticeable. But when you are cutting one of these bigger ones, you want to pay attention. It can actually be quite tough and fibrous. Sometimes that causes people to lose control of the knife and they cut themselves. In the business, we call that a parsnip slip. So please cut carefully. And since I'm not planning to strain this soup later, if it does feel extra tough and fibrous, I will sometimes cut those pieces out. So you make the call on that. That's up to you. You are the Dwight Schrute of your vegetables and fruit. And then once we have those cut up, we will transfer those onto a foil-lined baking sheet and move on to prepping the apple. And you don't have to, but I'm going to peel my apples. Like I said, I prefer not to have to strain this later. And the last thing you want when you're eating a beautiful silky soup is tough little microscopic pieces of apple peel stuck to the back of your throat. Nobody wants that. So I'm going to peel the apple, cut the core out, and then slice them up like this. And we'll add that to our parsnips. And then before we roast this, we'll give this a little drizzle of olive oil. Maybe a little bit more than a little. And we'll also give that a generous sprinkling of kosher salt. And then let's give those a little toss to make sure they're coated with that oil. And at that point, we will put those in the center of a 450-degree oven for about 30 minutes, or until they look like this. The edges should be pretty well caramelized, and everything should be pretty tender. And of course, you can make soup without roasting the vegetables first, but by roasting, you really concentrate those flavors, and I think you get a much better final product. But anyway, once our parsnips and apples are roasted nicely, we will transfer those into our soup pot, along with one russet potato that I peeled and cut in eighths. And then we go ahead and fill this up with broth or water or a combination. In fact, that's what I'm doing. I'm going to add about a quart of chicken broth and a couple cups of water. And of course, we're using cold, fresh water. And we'll give that a little stir. And then stop me if you've heard this one before. But what we're going to do is bring this up to a boil on high heat. And then, of course, we'll back the heat down to maintain a nice steady simmer. And we'll simmer that for about 30 minutes or until everything's very, very tender and completely blendable. Now, of course, we already roasted the vegetables, so those should be no problem. But definitely double check your chunks of potato. And when those are nice and soft, we are ready to blend. And I'm going to use my stick blender, also known as an immersion blender, just because it's so fast and easy. But if you don't have one, no problem. You can just carefully process this in a couple batches in a regular blender. As long as you get it really, really smooth, you're ready for the next step. So we're going to blend that up. And then what we'll do is we'll grab a spoon and taste this, but not for taste, for texture. Because right here is where you're going to decide if you're going to strain it or not. So give it a taste, and if it's beautifully silky and smooth like mine was, you do not need to strain it. However, if it seems a little fibrous for whatever reason, take an extra minute and put this through a fine strainer and return it to the pot. And at that point, we're ready to move on to the final steps. And at this point, we'll stir in our cream. Beautiful, beautiful heavy cream in all its 36% butterfat glory. And while we're stirring that in, we're sort of thinking about the texture. And after you stir the cream in, if you do want to thin it out a little bit, you can add another splash of broth, which is what I did right here. I mean, I like a thick soup, but I don't like too thick of a soup. So I stirred in some broth, and once that soup has come back up to temperature and it's nice and piping hot, you're ready to serve. Except, of course, for the most important step. We have to taste for salt and seasoning. All right, 95% of all soups that people think are terrible are simply undersalted. So I seasoned mine with some salt. I also snuck in a little pinch of cayenne to bring out all the other flavors. And once your soup is seasoned to your idea of perfection, then finally we're ready to grab a ladle and serve this up. And right here you can get a really good look at that final texture. All right, not too thick, not too thin. For me, that's just perfect. I want it to be rich and satisfying, but I don't want it to be like a bowl of pureed vegetables. And at that point, we will ladle it up into some hot bowls. And this soup really is so good you could eat it plain, but don't. You're going to want to garnish this with some croutons, but not just any croutons. You're going to want to use some blue cheese croutons. Yes, thanks to a recent technological breakthrough, I've discovered a way to infuse croutons with blue cheese, which were just beyond amazing on this soup, and I'm happy to announce I will be showing you how to do that in the next video, so stay tuned for that. And then for the last final touches, I decided to crumble on a little more blue cheese and a pinch of fresh chive, and that roasted apple and parsnip soup is done. And for a humble winter soup, it was fantastic. As you may know, parsnips have a delicious earthy flavor with just that little anise flavor in the background. And of course, the apples are providing a little sweetness, as did our roasting process. And of course, everything is set off by those crunchy, slightly salty, somewhat funky croutons. Just a gorgeous collection of taste and textures. I mean, this stuff was so good, it'll totally make you forget that after lunch, you're going to have to go outside and spend an hour shoveling the driveway, said the chef in San Francisco, where it's currently 68 degrees. But anyway, the point was this was amazing. So I really do hope you give it a try. Head over to foodwishes.com for all the ingredient amounts and more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.